This is Lynn Fraser. I'm here today from the Kilby Center with Tessie Castillo. She works in harm reduction. And I'm going to turn it over to you, Tessie, and I'd like you to introduce yourself and the agency that you work for, and just tell us a bit about the work that you do and how you got into it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I'm Tessie Castillo. I'm the Advocacy and Communications Coordinator for the North Carolina Harm Reduction Coalition. And we're a small statewide agency in North Carolina. We work with people who are using drugs and people who have a friend or family member who may be using. We help with things like overdose prevention and education about drug use, syringe exchange programs, law enforcement assisted diversion programs. We really try to reduce the consequences of death or disease or wrongful incarceration by people who are using drugs, to take it more towards a health approach rather than a criminal one to the issue of using.
That's a big shift from the war on drugs that most people think. Is that something that feels like it's kind of common, that people are moving towards that now? Because it's not necessarily perception in the media.
Yeah, people are starting to move that way, which is very encouraging. We've even seen a radical difference in the past few years. When we started, around 2011 was when we first started talking about syringe exchange, at least when I was there. I've been there for 7 years. And when we started out, we got doors slammed in our face. Nobody wanted to speak to us about it. It was a very taboo subject. You know, why would you consider giving a needle to a person who's injecting drugs? And in 2016, we legalized it. And we did that with the assistance of law enforcement agencies across the state and public health departments and members of the community. We got a state that has a very hostile legislature to this kind of thing to legalize that with a majority. I mean, so the needle has definitely shifted on this issue, and we've seen that happen drastically, even just in the past 5 years or so.
Wow, that's a huge shift. I was involved with an AIDS organization in the 80s, and needle exchange was a very hot topic back then too. And it was really clear that it would prevent deaths from HIV, but still people, a lot of misconceptions around that. So what do you feel is behind that shift? What are you seeing that people are acknowledging now maybe that they weren't before? Is there a lesson of some of that stigma, or what's going on behind the scenes?
A few things. I think one thing is that we've seen our normal approach to drug use, which is lock people up, put them away for as long as possible, is their fault, it's a moral failing to use drugs. That's been going on for a couple of decades now, pretty heavily. And we've seen that drugs have not gone away because of that, that addiction is only getting worse, that the cost of incarceration, both in terms of just in financial terms and also in human terms, has been substantial. And so people are starting to get tired of that. We see that in law enforcement a lot. The cops who started off at the beginning really gung-ho about locking up the bad guys, 30 years later, when the same problem is there, they're starting to finally sit back and say, okay, this is not working. We need to do something different. So that's one reason. It's just fatigue, sort of war on drugs fatigue, and recognition that these really harsh tactics have not worked. I think another major reason is honestly because the opioid epidemic is causing this change for a couple of reasons. One, because it's so widespread and it's so deadly on a scale that we haven't seen with other forms of drugs. And also because it's affecting affluent communities, white communities, children of judges and politicians and law enforcement. And so the folks who are in power and who have the ability to change the laws and to change policy around this now see people within their own families who are affected. And so it's more difficult for them to say, well, those people are bad and immoral and dangerous, and we need to get our people away from those people by locking them up. Now there's a blur between who us and them are, and it's forcing them to face this and to be more compassionate about it, which is good, but also very unfortunate that that's what it takes.
It is. Yeah. Yeah. I with the real dramatic increase in deaths, particularly amongst white people,
Mhm.
I've noticed a big change in the media about it as well.
Huge. I mean, it used to be the story of someone addicted to heroin was, you know, poor, black, and dangerous. And now you see, oh, this white high school kid had an athletic injury, got addicted, couldn't help it, spiraled out of control. Now he's dead and his family's grieving. And that's the narrative that you see played over and over and over again, much more sympathetic. And that's helping to turn the tide as well.
Hmm. So in North Carolina, the prison population is very much affected by the war on drugs. A lot of people are in, even because they can't afford to post bail or because they've been convicted of some drug charge. Do you see any shift around how people are looking at that?
Not enough. The shifts that we've seen are more towards let's do some diversion programs so that not so many people wind up in the prison system. As far as the people who are already there, haven't seen a whole lot done for them to provide treatment. Sentencing reform is something that we just started talking about here. There's going to be a task force organized. Hopefully there's a bill that the governor will sign within the next few days that actually creates a task force to look at sentencing reform. But it's only for opioids, which again is going to increase the racial disparities in this issue. And it's unfortunate that a lot of the programs that we're coming up with and a lot of the really positive reforms are so opioid focused, both because it doesn't recognize the problem of drugs as a whole.
Right.
It would primarily benefit people who are white and leave people of color out on the sidelines once again. And it doesn't allow us to prepare for the next wave of drugs. I mean, opioids are in now, but they'll go out of style eventually and something else will come up. And if all we know is how to deal with opioids, then we'll be completely unprepared for the next wave of drugs, which makes us more likely to respond in an emotional, scary, let's lock everybody up and impose harsh penalties once again with that next wave. So it's one thing that we're trying to do now is expand that conversation. Just go to these kind of task forces and say, hey, you can't just focus on opioids. We're leaving ourselves wide open to getting hit by the next wave of drugs and being unprepared. And you're also reinforcing the same racial disparities in sentencing that we already see.
Right. It seems that the epidemic, as it's happening, and it has been happening for the last few decades for sure, has an underbelly in trauma and despair and in our lack of agency in our lives. And there's so much that's underneath. Why would someone use drugs? Why, you have that story of the innocent, sports hero who got addicted, and it's certainly valid. It's certainly something that happens in our neurobiology, it hijacks the brain. All of that is absolutely true. And the rest is also true. There's a real link with trauma and social class and economics and all kinds of things. Can you talk a little bit about that? What do you see around that?
When I do see that, obviously most of the folks have some kind of something in their background that sort of triggered this. I would say even the people who seem really innocent, like they had it all, they were raised in a great family and they had money and a whole future ahead of them. They often have something too, and sometimes it's just a lack of, I don't know, purpose, I guess, sense of purpose, and an aimlessness that causes some experimentation, which then leads to outcomes that they weren't expecting. So I think with everybody, even if the trauma isn't obvious, there's something there. There's some sort of space that is being filled with the drugs, and drugs can do a great job of helping to people with mental illnesses or just some they need something, and drugs fill that niche, and that's why people use them. whatever that niche tends to be for them is different for everyone.
Do you have any sense of what it is that would allow a person to get to that point where they're willing and they're ready to stop using drugs? What are your thoughts on that? Do you work in that area at all with people who use drugs? Or I know that your coalition does.
Yeah, so we see, we don't provide recovery services ourselves. We link people to recovery services. So we'll take them in through our naloxone distribution program or our syringe exchange program or our diversion program, and then refer them to recovery services. And one thing that I've found really instrumental in people's recovery, which is a little bit different from what we keep hearing about how people need to hit rock bottom. And I think that's one thing that's driving our punitive policies, is that if we just take away everything they have, strip them of their freedom, their family, their jobs, everything, they'll hit rock bottom and then they'll come back up. And we've really found that although there are stories like that where you hear people say it wasn't until I lost everything that I realized, we've actually seen more people who have started their journey to recovery when they found something to live for, when they found something to love, when they felt that they did have something to lose. So for example, we've had people come to our syringe exchange program who have lost everything and haven't had much, both in terms of physical comforts or a sense of self-worth for many years now. And they've gotten involved in the syringe exchange program, and through that they've started volunteering and they've started to help their peers and reach out to others, and that has just given them such a sense of purpose in their lives. And we've seen people recover because of that, just sort of regain this love for living and this love for something. Most of the people I know using drugs love to help other people, and if you give them some opportunity to volunteer or to be useful, they blossom. And with that, they can use drugs less or stop using it all, or start to really think about themselves, because they're valuing themselves in a way that they didn't before. And that allows them to make steps towards their health and towards recovery.
That's such an important point. And it's absolutely at the key. It's at the base of all of what we're doing. You can't expect someone who loathes themselves and who's running away from trauma and who has lost everything to have the ability, even in the nervous system. Everything gets so shattered and so traumatized in the nervous system. And those experiences of connection with other people. Dr. Gabor Mate talks a lot about that connection that we need with other people. And we need to down-regulate and self-regulate the nervous system, but we also need to co-regulate with other people. That's how we're made. And so your point that you made about families and helping each other can really give someone the base then from which they could feel that their life is worthwhile enough that they could stop. It's a hard thing to stop using drugs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Especially when you have nothing. I mean, when you've lost everything, it's so hard to climb back up, and people try, you know? And that's what a lot of folks don't see. They're trying, but if you've got everything in your life broken, you can't just fix it all at once magically. So we want to try to not break as many things as possible so that it's just more sustainable when someone finally makes that decision to get into recovery. They don't have to fix everything in their life.
Right. So can you say a little bit about the diversion program? What's that all about?
So it's called LEAD, Law Enforcement Assisted Diversion. And under that program, law enforcement are able to, instead of arresting a low-level drug offender or someone involved in sex work, they refer them to us, to the North Carolina Harm Reduction Coalition. And we give that person case management and sort of work with them one-on-one with whatever they need. Sometimes that does mean recovery, and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it means housing, or it means reunification with their kids, or it means just getting food, an ID card, medication, some basic stuff. And so our case managers just kind of work with the person one-on-one. Hey, what do you need to try to address some of the root causes of the crime that they're participating in? And that program has been shown, there's several across the country now. We started the first one in the South, in Fayetteville, North Carolina, and it's shown really remarkable results in other areas, a 58% reduction in recidivism rates, and much higher participation in social services from people who are participating in the program, much lower cost. It's cheaper to provide case management and treatment than it is to put someone in jail. So we're really hoping that, and we're seeing more communities start to catch on to this idea, and it's spreading very quickly in other cities, even just here in North Carolina, but also across the country.
Wow, that's incredible.
Mm-hmm.
It's amazing to be part of something like that,
Mm-hmm.
and to see how impacted people are by their circumstances, and then for someone to have the opportunity to meet with someone who's not going to judge them, not going to punish them. They're just going to go, okay, what's the situation and how can we help get your life stable again? And
yeah. And it's important also to not assume that you know what they need.
right.
And take somebody in and say, all right, you have a drug problem, so you need treatment immediately, and you need this. Well, we really ask the person what they need, and they know better than we do. That's a big part of it, that we don't penalize people for relapsing. We don't penalize people for not accepting drug treatment. We just accept them and we help them along that journey. And often what you see is someone who initially may have refused drug treatment and said, oh, I don't need that. After they're receiving the other services, and again, they're sort of regaining a sense of stability in their lives, just with basic human necessities. After that is when they're more in the mindset where they can start thinking about recovery. And that's what a lot of people don't understand. They'll go to someone who's using, who may have overdosed recently, and they'll offer to say, all right, well, you need treatment now, you almost died. And when the person refuses treatment, they get angry. It's, why aren't you receiving treatment? What's wrong with you? And they just need to understand that a lot of people, they can't even begin to think about treatment if they don't have a house over their head. And if they've got pending charges and all this, they're just not in the mindset to take care of themselves. So you have to deal with those first, and then allow the person to move in that direction at their own pace.
At their own pace, yeah. Well, and that has an underlying respect for another human being built right into it, which isn't always the case. And
usually not with people who use drugs.
Right.
I often hear them referred to as children. They don't know what's good for them. We know what's good for them.
That does seem to be a common human pattern of thinking we know what's good for everybody else.
Yeah, we all do that.
And even when we know what's good for ourselves, we don't always do it. But somehow we think other people should. Yeah. So the connection of you mentioned people who do sex work, and are you finding that most of the people who do sex work have trauma backgrounds, have addiction going on as well?
Most, yeah, not all, but there's definitely a connection. People who start in sex work for whatever reason, then switch over, start using drugs just to cope with some of the realities of sex work and some of the trauma that happens even while they're doing it.
While they're doing it, yes.
And then on the flip side, some people start using drugs and then do sex work because they need money to support the drug habit. So they're very interwoven.
Right. And the stigma around sex work and around drugs and all of that makes everything so much more difficult.
Yeah, there's even more stigma around sex work than there's around drugs, it feels like right now.
Right. So the philosophy is right in your name, harm reduction. Is that something that is hard for some people to get on board with?
Yes. Definitely, again, going back to this, we know what's good for you mentality. Also, I think, especially in the United States, we're such purists. We like to think in terms of good guy and bad guy, and we don't like nuance at all. And harm reduction is all about nuance. It's saying any positive change is a good thing, and we want that. So if you have an issue with drugs and you can reduce your drug use but not stop it completely, that's great. That's recovery for us. Or even if you don't stop using drugs at all, but you're able to stabilize something else in your life, stabilize some of your familial relationships, find a steady job, even if you're continuing to use, that's still a positive step in your life. And that is recovery for us as well. It's very hard for people to understand, but just as we've seen the shift over the past few years towards people adopting a more public health focused approach to drugs, harm reduction has been accepted into that. Going back to when we started, no one would talk to us. We were considered a tiny radical organization. We were very taboo.
Mm-hmm.
And now we get invited to speak at all these government conferences, and other people are talking about harm reduction who don't work in harm reduction. And so we've really seen a pretty quick adaptation of it in many areas of the state, which has been very encouraging, although of course there are a lot of holdouts still.
Right.
There will always be holdouts.
There will always be holdouts, yeah. Well, and the big benefit to that too, of course, is that people's misery is lessened. People have more stability in their life, but they stay alive long enough perhaps to get into treatment.
Yeah.
And that's huge.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
There's hope as long as they're still alive.
Right. And the naloxone treatment, is that something that's fairly well accepted? Or I know that that's pretty controversial in the media, whether or not people should be even have access to that in case there's an overdose.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So when we first started off, it was not very accepted.
Mm-hmm.
People thought it was a plan B. They thought it would be abused. And then it started to become very accepted. We have now over a third of law enforcement departments in North Carolina who are carrying naloxone, down from 1 in 2014, or up from 1, rather, from 1 to like 150.
Wow.
3 years.
Wow, that's great.
And we've distributed kits all over the state. We passed a law in 2016 where the state medical director signed a standing order so that anyone could go into any pharmacy in North Carolina and they can get naloxone without a prescription. So it has become widely accepted over the past 3 years. We have recently seen a little bit of the start of a backlash again. And I think it's just, again, those holdouts, people who were never on board with this, starting to get more vocal, and then the media picks it up because they like controversy.
Yeah, they do.
I don't honestly think that there's a lot of people who have major issues with naloxone. Most people are starting to recognize that saving a life is saving a life, and that, again, you can't get a dead person into recovery. But there are some people who are vocal, and they tend to get a lot of attention, and it's unfortunate. But there are people out there who just don't care. They think if you use drugs, you should face the consequences, including death. There's nothing we can do about people who think like that.
Yeah, that's true. Well, and fear is such a part of the whole issue of addiction. Fear that, someone I love could go down that road, they could die, and fear of the other, those bad drug addicts that are mostly Black, they're incarcerated, they're scary, they're going to steal from me, all of that. And fear is such at the heart of being an addict too, and needing to get away from our own experience. It seems that it just permeates the whole field.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I sort of touched on it before, but now that we, at least here in North Carolina, have been able to take the conversation from we don't even want to talk about harm reduction, we don't even want to talk about syringe exchange or naloxone, to a widespread acceptance and practice, we're getting concerned that the conversation is more narrow than we would like more opioid focused than we feel comfortable with. And again, we have this natural tendency to box people into good and bad. And so what we're seeing happening is, all right, we'll help the opioid users, but not the other drug users, or will help people who are addicted to drugs, but people who are selling drugs are still terrible people. And they're always trying to draw these lines. And so I think the big challenge for us now as harm reductionists, now that people will listen to us in a way that they never would before, now that we have the ear of law enforcement, the ear of politicians and the government and their respect, is to expand their mindset to understand that this is not just about opioids, and that this is not just about people addicted to drugs, but that people who sell also, they sell for the same reasons, for necessity, for putting a roof over their head, because they didn't have any other opportunities for work as growing up in their neighborhoods, because they have a felony, and because of the felony they can't get jobs, they can't get housing, they can't get anything, and so selling drugs is the only way to make money for them. And that's because of a system that we set up with the barriers that we place on people who have felonies. So that's something that I'm really trying to focus on now, is to focus my media stuff on let's expand these boundaries. Don't try to help just this little amount of people. Let's talk about drug policy as a whole, and also trying to put a little more of the racial implications into the conversation as well, because this is something that we've tried to avoid talking about in many ways. We use code words. We say, people from good families are dying now, or the face of drug use is changing, or it's not just homeless people who are dying. I've heard people say stuff like that, which is really troublesome. So we'd really like to get people to recognize these issues in a broader sense, and not try to keep drawing their little lines between good and bad.
That's a kind of a big job.
Yeah. This is the way that we think as people, since we were little with our little cartoon villains.
Well, and it gets back to what you said a little while ago about being radical, that your organization, just the idea of harm reduction was considered radical, and how that has moved now into more acceptance. People can really get it, that it's necessary and that it's helpful, and it's the whole punishment kind of way that people were working doesn't work. And if people could take their sympathy and compassion for someone from a family that's more like theirs, and then translate that into, well, okay, what about people from other kinds of families? They're human too. And the hope would be that they could broaden their field of compassion to include everybody.
That's what we're working on.
Yeah. Yeah. And are you connected with other harm reduction organizations around the country? Is there a national presence in that too?
There is a National Harm Reduction Coalition. We are partners with a lot of those organizations, yes. And they all do the same kind of work. Right.
And do you work at all with families of people that come in through like the diversion program or something? Is there a role for the families in this?
Yeah, we work, especially with the overdose stuff. We focus a lot on families so that they know how to recognize an overdose and how to respond to one with naloxone. So families are incredibly critical in all of this piece, because again, part of just being whole as a person is having a sense of belonging and a sense of love from your family. We get a lot of families who come to us very desperate. Their situation has already gotten really out of control. They've got a loved one who's using, maybe stealing, been in and out of rehab. The parents are sort of at their wits' end, afraid of that phone call, that their child has passed away. And so they come to us. And they're some of the hardest people to work with for me, just because of the genuineness of the grief and the sense of helplessness a lot of times that they feel. And the hardest thing is to try to get families to understand that this is not their fault, and that they don't have a whole lot of control over what happens, which is difficult for people. Because we see parents who say, my child is out there using, they're going to kill themselves, can't I get them involuntarily committed? Can't I get them arrested? So at least they're off the streets. And we try to work with them to help them realize that that person needs to make those choices on their own, to get that help, that arresting somebody and give them a record, which is going to make it harder to recover. Same thing for involuntary commitment. We don't want this attitude of, again, people who are using drugs have no autonomy and they're not adults and can't make their own decisions, so let's make the decisions for them, which on a societal level is easier for us to say, let's not judge as a society, let's not try to control people as a society. But when you're a parent and you don't want your child to die, it is much harder to have that conversation. I mean, I'm a parent too. I could not imagine being in a situation like that, and how it would just destroy me. So those are the hardest conversations that we have to have, is to try to support the family and let them understand that love and support is the best thing that they can do for their child at that time. But that there's not a whole lot else, which is the hardest thing, because we want to fix problems.
Well, we especially want to fix problems that could lead to somebody dying.
Yeah.
There's such an urgency there. Yeah, I work with the Kilby Center Family Program, and one of everything you're saying applies absolutely. And one of the things that we try to get people to focus on is to really do their own inner work around fear and anxiety and blame and guilt. And it's such a mess of shame and all kinds of things going on inside. And just that fear. As a heroin addict, just clean for a year now. And it's been such a journey for her. And she's pretty much at the point now where she's got her hands out of it. And she's like, it's not up to me. I can't make him recover. And to respect his own autonomy. And he's doing really well. But the fear can just immobilize people and create all kinds of enabling. And yeah, it's a really, really tough situation to be in.
Yeah. Those are my hardest cases.
Yeah.
Because they really are. But we do try to tell them, focus on yourself, get educated about what addiction is and what the drugs are, and take care of yourself and have support groups for yourself, because that's really all you can do at this point.
Right. Yeah. Are you connected with 12-step groups at all?
So we do some education in some 12-step programs. There's a really great recovery community here in North Carolina, which encompasses the full spectrum of all recovery services, everything from 12-step all the way over to more harm reduction stuff. We partner with them frequently to do overdose prevention stuff, or syringe exchange, or whatever they ask us for.
Oh, okay. Right. And a lot of the people that you're working with in the diversion program, do they attend 12-step meetings, or is that something that would happen kind of outside of what you're doing?
They can. We refer them to wherever they want to go. Step is the best choice for them, and that's what they want, then we'll refer them to a 12-step program. And if it's not, then we'll refer them somewhere else.
Right. So there's a broad range of options. Yeah. 12-step programs have been incredibly helpful, and they're not for everybody. Yeah. Or not at a certain time anyway. Yeah. Yeah.
That's what we find. I mean, we want people to have as many choices as they can. I think it's dangerous to get into a mentality either where you think, 12-step is the only path to recovery, which a lot of people do have that mentality. Or there's some people who hate 12 steps and don't want, and think it's like a cult, Right. So we don't encourage either of those ways of thinking. We try to embrace all forms of recovery for people.
Right. What would you recommend to someone? Like, you see so many people coming in, and I think we've already covered a lot of this, but do you have if someone's listening to this right now and they're not in North Carolina and they can't come to your program, but what would you suggest would be some really necessary, important first steps for people to take if they're in recovery, early in recovery, or if they're wanting to go into recovery?
Probably just reaching out to whatever your local resources are to just get some education first. I think that's the best first option. Figuring out again what addiction is. A lot of people, even who are addicted themselves, they don't know anything about what it is, or they might think it's just they're not strong enough to stop using drugs. And so getting into a program like that, finding a community of people who can help you is so critical. And a community of people who are committed to your recovery as opposed to, or your wellness, as opposed to the normal communities when you're using drugs, everybody's using drugs. And so it's kind of hard to get away from that and to think differently or to even imagine your life different. I think peer support services are probably the best thing for people who are looking at their options, because in a peer support service, you're with people who have already been through it. So they know everything that you're going through. They can direct you towards the best resources in your area. They can be just a shoulder for you to lean on as you're going through that process, more so than any other kind of help that you could receive. And they can open you up to the different options that may be available and kind of help you decide which one is good for you or if this is the right time for you. So that's who I would go to first, is peer support services.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
That makes sense. Yeah. So one of the things that we've been asking people is if they have a quote or something that they are guided by in their work. Do you have something like that that comes to mind?
Well, in harm reduction, our quote is that we meet people where they're at. That is something that I always try to remember, because even I, after working in this field for 7 years, can get to the point where I get frustrated with someone for not accepting the help that I'm offering. And so it's constantly a struggle to sort of dial it back and say, all right, well, they're not there yet. And I need to meet them where they're at, exactly where they're at. And in some cases, that's just listening to them for a little bit and offering some advice, which they're not going to take yet. But that's okay, because that's where they're at right now. They just need to talk to somebody and to be listened to for a while. So that's what I go on.
Do you have a kind of a process that you do to work with that frustration internally?
I think I have a good work-life balance personally.
Yeah,
So
that helps.
at the end of the day, when I come home from work, I have things that I do that make me happy and that are not work related, and people who I hang out with, so that I just feel a healthy sense of self and don't get dragged down by the frustrations of the work sometimes.
Is that something that is recognized in the organization, the difficulty of being frontline with people with addiction, the frustration of that?
Yeah, I think some people are better at self-care than others.
Yeah.
But there's definitely a recognition. This is something we even talk about when we interview people. One of the interview questions we ask new employees is, what are your self-care practices? What do you like to do in your free time? Just to make sure that we're getting a person who's well balanced and can handle the difficulties of working in this kind of environment where it can be very frustrating sometimes. Not just with individual people, but with the whole systems. I mean, working with lobbyists and the politicians who are not doing the right thing just because it doesn't benefit them personally. All of that can be so frustrating. Or hearing people in the news say we should only administer naloxone once and then let them die the second time, and you're just like, Yeah.
Being disheartened can happen when we're doing this kind of work.
Yeah.
It's hard to see that kind of heartlessness, or people so entrenched in their own position that they can't really see the humanity.
Yeah, I go through that a lot. I have a lot of really moments in my work.
Yeah, that. Yeah. So this summit is a collection of people that are doing all kinds of things in recovery. It's a very broad base. And so the people that are watching it over this couple of days in September will see all kinds of approaches and methods and innovation. And, there's yours, there's, the Kilby Center for Recovery is a mindfulness-based trauma-first center, which is quite unusual. It's, we're talking to people who've had long-term experience in AA and all kinds of people, therapists, different things. So if you could speak to everybody kind of in this field, the whole recovery field, what would you say would be really important for people to hear, both the people that are working in recovery and the people that are, the politicians and everybody that's involved in this? What would you say to them?
To everyone?
You can make a list and go down it if you want.
I think as far as people who are the policymakers and who are the decision makers with this, it's so important for us to break down those walls between us and them, and to even practice the very simple thing of being able to put yourself in the shoes of another person. Because that's what we don't do when we're coming up with these really harsh, ineffective, merciless policies, is we're just dividing people. So just some self-reflection and some breaking down those boundaries is what people need, I think, to move forward with that. And as far as people who work in the field, I'd say the same thing to them that I'd say to the families. I mean, take care of yourself, learn as much as you can, help where you can help, but recognize that you can't control all of this. There's so much that's outside of our control. The people we're serving have autonomy and they need to be able to make their own decisions. So you can't step in and try to fix them. And so accepting your own lack of control in some of these situations is really important to be able to continue the work in a sustainable way. Those will be my messages.
That's great, thank you. And so if people would like to get a hold of you, what's the best way to do that?
You can go to our website, www.nchrc.org. That's for North Carolina Harm Reduction Coalition. And there's a staff page on there, and I have my email address and phone number.
We've covered a lot of ground. It's been really interesting talking with you. And I want to thank you for being part of the summit. It's been great to have you here. And, I didn't know a lot about what's going on in harm reduction. And before I started researching for the summit, I had certain ideas about what's happening in, the police forces and government agencies and people that are working in this that haven't actually turned out to be entirely true. Mm-hmm. So it's quite encouraging to find out that it's not just Portugal who has this program of not criminalizing drug users. It's actually happening in North Carolina. It's happening, all over the United States and Canada and the rest of the world too. So that's a real misconception that I had coming into it that I'm really happy to see isn't really the case, that things, even in a couple of years, have shifted really dramatically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So thanks for being part of the summit.
No problem.
Go to kilbycenter.com, Radical Recovery Summit, to see the full schedule of speakers and to register to watch these free online September 23rd and 24th in the Radical Recovery Summit 2017.